Whatever happened to Lyoto Machida?
I was waiting for the right timing.
If you were watching during his prime, you know exactly how special this guy was. Machida wasn't just another fighter. He brought something completely different to the octagon.
He's the Karate Kid.
Something that we had never seen before. His style, his presence, and the way he took out his opponents made him a fan favorite. But what exactly made Machida stand out from the rest? It wasn't the usual boxing, wrestling, or jiu-jitsu that you would expect from top-level fighters. Machida brought Shotokan karate to the UFC, a style that many thought had no place in modern MMA. But here's the thing, not only did he make it work, he made it deadly. Machida's game was all about elusiveness, patience, and precision. He didn't charge forward like most fighters. Instead, he made you come to him. And the moment you slipped up, bam, he would counter with pinpoint accuracy. His movement was so slick that some people said trying to hit him was like chasing smoke. He made even the most seasoned of fighters look silly, and when he knocked someone out, it was pure artistry. They called him the Dragon for a reason. His calm, calculated approach inside the cage was something to behold. And soon, people started talking about the Machida era, because for a while, he looked unbeatable. He had 16 fights undefeated, a streak that most fighters can only dream of. And it wasn't just nobodies that he was beating. We're talking legends like Tito Ortiz and Thiago Silva. And when he fought Rashad Evans for the light heavyweight belt at UFC 98, he didn't just win, he destroyed him. That knockout left Evans out cold. And at that moment, everyone thought Machida would rule the division for years to come. But as we all know, things in MMA can change fast. So how did one of the most dominant fighters of his time go from being untouchable to struggling to stay relevant? The false starts with Shogun Rua. The first real crack in Machida's dominance came against a name that every fight fan knows, Mauricio Shogun Rua. The two met at UFC 104 for Machida's first title defense. Leading up to the fight, most people thought Machida would handle Rua easily. After all, Machida hadn't lost a single round in the UFC. But Shogun came with a game plan that no one had used against Machida before: leg kicks. Shogun spent the entire fight chopping down Machida's legs, which were the foundation of his movement and elusive style. For the first time, Machida looked vulnerable. After 5 rounds, the judges gave the decision to Machida, but it was a controversial call. Many fans, fighters, and analysts thought Shogun had done enough to win. You could feel the tension in the air. This was the first time that the Machida era looked shaky. Now the rematch at UFC 113, that's where the wheels really started to come off. Shogun wasn't interested in leaving it to the judges this time. Early in the fight, Shogun found an opening and knocked Machida out cold. For a lot of fans, it was shocking to see. Machida went from being the guy that no one could touch to getting finished inside of 2 rounds. And just like that, the aura of invincibility was gone. This loss was more than just a defeat. It was a sign that Machida's karate-based style wasn't untouchable. Fighters started to see the blueprint. Leg kicks, pressure, and aggression could give you a shot against him. And that was the beginning of Machida's struggles, as the sport of MMA was rapidly evolving. Trying to bounce back. After losing his title, Machida didn't give up though. He was still one of the top guys in the division, and he was determined to climb back to the top. But this is where things started to get complicated. His performances became inconsistent, and he had trouble regaining that same dominance that he once had. His next fight was against Rampage Jackson at UFC 123, a former champion with serious knockout power. This was a close back-and-forth fight that ended in another controversial split decision. Rampage ended up getting the win, but a lot of fans thought Machida had done enough to take the fight. Once again, a decision didn't go his way, and this loss added to his frustration. But just when you thought Machida might be on the decline for good, he gave us one of the most iconic moments in UFC history. At UFC 129, Machida faced Randy Couture, one of the most respected veterans in the sport. And what did Machida do? He landed a front kick to the face that not only knocked Couture out cold, but literally sent his tooth flying out of his mouth. That knockout was straight out of a movie, and fans started talking about the Machida era making a comeback. Apparently the Dragon still had some fire left in him. Unfortunately though, that fire didn't last long. In his next big fight, Machida faced the rising phenom Jon Jones at UFC 140. At the time, Jones was just starting his reign of terror over the light heavyweight division, and Machida gave him one of his tougher tests. In the first round, Machida's movement and counter-striking seemed to confuse Jones a little. Machida landed a few solid shots, but in the second round, Jones took control. Jones locked in a standing guillotine choke and put Machida to sleep, dropping him like a rag doll to the canvas. Watching Machida crumple like that was brutal, and it was clear that Jones was the new king of the division. At this point, Machida was struggling to keep up with the sport's evolving landscape. Fighters were figuring out how to deal with his elusive style, and the competition was getting tougher. Machida was no longer the unsolvable puzzle that he once was, and his quest to regain the title seemed more difficult than ever. Dropping to middleweight. By 2013, it was clear that Machida needed a change. The light heavyweight division was full of killers, and Machida's karate-based style just wasn't working the way that it used to against the stronger, bigger guys in the division. So Machida made the decision to drop down to middleweight. This move to middleweight breathed new life into Machida's career. His speed and movement translated well against smaller opponents, and in his middleweight debut, he fought Mark Munoz and knocked him out with a head kick in the first round. That win made people think, hold up, maybe Machida's found his new home. It was like we were watching vintage Machida again, calm, calculated, and lethal. His next few fights at middleweight showed that he still had plenty of fight left in him. He picked up wins over Gegard Mousasi and even earned a shot at the middleweight title against Chris Weidman at UFC 175. The fight with Weidman was close and competitive, with Machida showing flashes of his former brilliance, especially in the later rounds. But ultimately, Weidman's wrestling and pressure earned him the decision win. The fight was probably Machida's last great performance in the UFC. While he didn't win, he proved he could still hang with the best in the world. But after this fight, we started to see more signs of decline. Machida was no longer the fighter who could consistently dominate opponents, and his age was starting to show. The downward spiral. After the Weidman fight, Machida's decline became more apparent. The next few years were tough to watch as a fan because you could see that the Dragon was slowing down. His reflexes weren't as sharp, and his ability to avoid damage was fading. The most heartbreaking part was seeing Machida get knocked out in brutal fashion. In 2015, he faced Luke Rockhold, who at the time was a surging contender in the middleweight division. Rockhold absolutely dominated the fight. He got Machida to the ground, beat him up with ground and pound, and eventually submitted him with a rear naked choke in the second round. It wasn't just a loss, it was a beatdown. And as if that wasn't enough, Machida fought Yoel Romero just a few months later, and that fight was even more brutal. Romero, a powerhouse wrestler with devastating knockout power, finished Machida with a series of vicious elbows on the ground. Watching Machida get knocked out by those elbows was tough. For fans who had seen him dominate in his prime, this was a painful reminder of how unforgiving the fight game can be. At this point, Machida's once invincible karate style was no longer enough. He had trouble keeping up with the new generation of fighters who were faster, stronger, and more aggressive. And the knockout losses were taking their toll, not just physically, but mentally as well. The 18-month suspension. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse for Machida, 2016 hit him with another blow. This time, it wasn't an opponent, it was USADA, the UFC's anti-doping agency. Machida tested positive for a banned substance, 7-keto-DHEA, which he claimed was an over-the-counter supplement that he didn't know was on the banned list. Despite his explanation, USADA hit him with an 18-month suspension. Now this suspension couldn't have come at a worse time. At 37 years old, Machida didn't have a lot of prime years left, and sitting on the sidelines for 18 months was a massive setback. It wasn't just about missing fights, it was about losing time. Machida was already showing signs of decline, and now he was forced to sit out for almost 2 years. When Machida finally returned in 2017, it was clear that the suspension had cost him more than just time. He had lost his momentum, and his performances reflected that. His confidence seemed off, and his rhythm, which was once so smooth and precise, wasn't the same. Final UFC fights. After serving his suspension, Machida had a few more fights in the UFC. First up was Eric Anders, a young, hungry prospect who was looking to make a name for himself by taking out a legend. The fight wasn't pretty, but both fighters had their moments, and it ended with a split decision win for Machida. It wasn't a dominant performance by any means, but it showed that Machida still had a little gas left in the tank. Then came Machida's final UFC moment of brilliance. At UFC 224, he faced another Brazilian legend, Vitor Belfort. And in typical Machida fashion, he delivered one last iconic moment. A front kick knockout that looked almost identical to the one he used to retire Randy Couture. Belfort went down, and that was all she wrote. It was a vintage Machida moment, and for a brief second, it felt like the old Machida was back. But that win wasn't enough to reignite his UFC career. The UFC was moving on, and Machida, at 40 years old, wasn't being offered the same high-profile fights anymore. It felt like the end of the road for him in the UFC. A new start in Bellator. In 2018, Machida made a move that surprised a lot of people. He left the UFC and signed with Bellator MMA. For Machida, this was an opportunity to start fresh, and Bellator welcomed him with open arms. It seemed like a good fit. Bellator's competition wasn't quite as stacked as the UFC's, and maybe this would give Machida the chance to finish his career on a high note. At first, things looked promising. In his Bellator debut, Machida fought Rafael Carvalho and won by split decision. He followed that up with a fight against Chael Sonnen, and once again, Machida gave us a vintage performance. He knocked Sonnen out in the second round with a series of brutal knees. It was clear that Machida still had the ability to finish fights, and fans started to wonder if this move to Bellator was going to give him the comeback story that he deserved. But then, reality set in. Machida started facing tougher opponents in Bellator, and the results weren't good. He lost back-to-back fights against Gegard Mousasi and Phil Davis, both by split decision. These were close fights, but the fact that Machida couldn't get the win showed that his skills were fading. The precision and timing that had made him great were no longer there. And then came the fight against Ryan Bader, where Machida was dominated over 5 rounds. Bader, a former UFC contender who had improved significantly since moving to Bellator, completely out-wrestled and outworked Machida. By this point, it was clear that Machida couldn't keep up with the top-level guys anymore. The final Bellator fights. Machida's final fight came in 2022 against Fabian Edwards, and it was a tough one to watch. Edwards, a rising star in Bellator, knocked Machida out in the first round. It was the kind of knockout that made you realize that Machida's time in the sport was over. There was no coming back from this. Seeing Machida lose like this was heartbreaking for his longtime fans. This was a guy who had once been the most elusive and dangerous striker in the world, and now he was getting knocked out by younger, hungrier fighters. It was the end of the road for the Dragon. So what is Machida up to now? So what's Lyoto Machida up to these days? Well, after that loss to Fabian Edwards, Machida hasn't officially announced his retirement, but it is pretty clear that his fighting career is over. At 44 years old, with all the wear and tear from a long and brutal career, it is unlikely we will see him back in the cage anytime soon. That being said, Machida has always been more than just a fighter. He is a true martial artist in every sense of the word. Since stepping away from active competition, he has been focused on coaching and mentoring the next generation of fighters. He has also been involved in seminars and karate promotions, sharing his knowledge and keeping the spirit of traditional martial arts alive. And of course, Machida has always been known as humble, respectful family man. He has stayed out of the spotlight for the most part, living a quiet life away from the chaos of the fight game. Even as his career wound down, Machida never lost that respect from fans and fighters alike. And that's because he carried himself with grace, both in victory and defeat. He was never the loud, brash trash talker. He was always humble, always a martial artist first. And that is a rare find in a sport that thrives on hype and drama. Machida's career reminds us that, in the end, it's not just about wins and losses. It's about what you leave behind. And Lyoto Machida leaves behind a legacy of innovation, humility, and a commitment to martial arts that transcends the fight game. The Dragon may no longer be in the octagon, but his fire will always burn in the sport of MMA.